There is a piece of footage that a small research team has watched more than 200 times, and not one of them can tell you what it shows. 19 seconds. 4 cameras. A shape moving along a fence line at 3 in the morning, keeping a distance from the wire that never once changes, and then, between one frame and the next, gone. No blur. No exit. Just there, and then not. Before we get into what happened on that fence line, and why it has quietly unraveled a decade of careful skepticism, I want to be upfront with you. This is a work of fiction. The ranch, the researchers, the footage, all of it is invented, built the way a ghost story is built, out of atmosphere and pacing and the shape of real investigative method. Nothing here claims to be a real event, a real place, or real evidence. It's a story. So if that's the kind of story you like, settle in, because this one gets strange fast. The property doesn't have a name people recognize, and that's on purpose. Call it the Hollow Basin Ranch. A few thousand acres of high desert scrub in a stretch of country where the land drops into long shallow bowls and the wind moves through the sage like something breathing. It changed hands in the late 1990s, sold cheap because the previous owner wanted out and wouldn't say why beyond a shrug and a comment about the cattle. The family that bought it were ranchers first, and skeptics by trade. You don't run livestock for a living by believing in monsters. But within their first 2 months on that land, 3 cows were found dead in the open pasture, with wounds too clean to belong to any predator native to that region, no blood pooled beneath them, and no tracks approaching or leaving the site. That's where the story usually starts, and it's exactly where I want to slow down, because the wounds were never the strange part. The strange part was what happened when the family stopped looking at the center of their land and started looking at its edges. 4 years, every account from that property fixed on the same handful of locations. A dry wash where the temperature reportedly dropped without explanation. A low rise of rock where lights were seen hovering, splitting apart, and reforming in ways that shouldn't have been possible for anything with mass and inertia. A stand of dead cottonwoods where recordings kept turning up static that some listeners swore had rhythm to it. Every investigator who came through, and there were several over 2 decades, aimed their equipment at those same 3 or 4 points like moths circling a single porch light. It made sense. That was where the reports came from. That was where the phenomenon, whatever it was, seemed to live. What almost nobody did, in 20 years of scattered investigation, was turn around and look at the boundary. The fence line. 4 strands of wire strung across roughly 11 miles of perimeter, mostly unremarkable, mostly ignored, existing in every account, as a background detail rather than a subject worth its own attention. That changed in 2019, when a small independent research group leased access to the property for an 18-month study. They weren't hunters of the paranormal in the dramatic sense. They were engineers and field technicians, the kind of people who get uncomfortable around the word supernatural and prefer to talk about anomalous data instead. Their plan was straightforward, and by the standards of everyone who'd worked that land before them, almost boringly methodical. Instead of chasing the hot zones everyone already knew about, they were going to instrument the boundary. All of it. Every yard of fence line, wired with overlapping sensor types, running continuously, whether or not a single person was standing on the property to watch. The reasoning came from a pattern buried in older field notes the team had gathered from previous researchers willing to talk. Equipment near the interior hot zones failed constantly and unpredictably, batteries draining in a fraction of their rated life, drives corrupting mid-recording, cameras that passed every diagnostic in the morning going dark by afternoon. Move the same gear a couple hundred yards away, and it worked fine. Bring it back, and it started failing again. On its own, that's an argument for bad batches of equipment, or some local electromagnetic quirk in the soil. But layered against it was something harder to wave off. The most dramatic sightings, the lights, the sounds, the unexplained shapes, clustered overwhelmingly around active investigation windows. Quiet nights with no one present tended to produce quiet data. Nights with a full crew standing in the field, cameras raised, attention focused, tended to produce the stories people remembered. Taken together, the team's working theory was uncomfortable but simple. Whatever was happening on that land seemed to respond to the act of being watched, and it seemed to calibrate its behavior to the sophistication of whoever was doing the watching. Cheap gear got vague, deniable results. Serious equipment got serious activity, but never more than the equipment could actually resolve, as if something on the other end understood exactly what each instrument was capable of registering and never gave it more than it could hold. If that was true, then 20 years of investigators pointing their best cameras at the same 3 hot spots had been, in effect, advertising exactly where to hide. The team's solution wasn't to build a better spotlight. It was to stop using one. They built a ring instead, wrapping the entire boundary in overlapping, independent sensors, so that nothing could move through the edge of that property without touching something, regardless of where any human being happened to be standing that night, or whether anyone was standing there at all. The ring wasn't built with a single kind of eye. That mattered more than anything else, because the team had learned, the hard way, that a single instrument can be argued with. A camera catches a smear on the lens, a heat mirage, a moth crossing too close to the sensor, and skeptics have a fair point when they say so. But a pattern that shows up simultaneously across 4 completely different kinds of physics is a much harder thing to dismiss. So along the fence, they buried infrared cameras to catch the heat signature of anything moving through absolute darkness. They mounted acoustic sensors tuned across the full range of human hearing and down into infrasound, the deep frequencies below what a person can consciously perceive, but can sometimes feel, the ones associated with a vague, wordless sense that something is wrong. They spaced electromagnetic field monitors at intervals along the wire, quietly logging the ambient field strength second by second, building weeks of baseline data for what that stretch of empty desert did on its own, with nothing unusual happening at all. And beneath all of that, they buried seismic sensors in the ground itself, calibrated not for footsteps on the surface, but for movement at depth, because an earlier, unrelated geological survey of the property had mapped a network of natural voids and channels running under parts of the land, hollow spaces in the rock that had never been fully explored and had nothing obvious to do with the surface phenomena everyone had been chasing for 20 years. The ring went active in the spring of 2020, and for months, it produced almost exactly what an empty, ordinary piece of desert should produce. Nothing. Baseline readings. Wind. Temperature drift. The occasional coyote crossing an infrared frame and vanishing off the other side of it in the unremarkable, ordinary way that coyotes do. The team maintained the system, rotated batteries, checked cabling, and settled into the long, patient rhythm of a study that might, in the end, simply confirm there was nothing there. That possibility never left the table, and to their credit, it never seemed to bother them. Good instrumentation proving a negative is still useful data. But there was one assumption buried underneath all of it that nobody on the team had thought hard enough to question, an assumption inherited from every investigation that came before them without ever being tested directly. They believed that when the crew went home and the lights went dark, the land went quiet with them. That an empty ranch was a sleeping ranch. At 17 minutes past 2 in the morning, that changed. The story doesn't need dramatics to become unsettling here. What happened first was small, almost administrative. The electromagnetic station nearest the northern boundary registered a rise in ambient field strength, not a spike, not the sharp jolt of a passing vehicle, or a switched circuit somewhere nearby, but a slow, steady climb that lifted clear of every baseline reading the team had built up over the preceding months and then simply held there, as though something had arrived at that patch of ground and settled into it. It stayed elevated for 11 minutes. Then, instead of fading, it began to move, the elevated reading appearing at the next station along the fence, and then the one after that, in a clean, sequential progression, the way a hand trails along a railing as someone walks its length. Whatever was distorting the field was not sitting still. It was traveling the boundary. 2 minutes into that movement, the acoustic sensors picked up something in the infrasound range, well below the floor of human hearing, a structured, rhythmic sequence that the team's analysts would spend days afterward trying and failing to match against any catalogued natural source, animal, weather, or mechanical. It arrived a full 2 minutes before anything appeared on any camera, which meant that whatever was moving along that fence line had, in effect, announced itself first in a register no person standing there could have consciously heard, only felt, as an unplaceable unease in the body. 2 minutes after that, the buried seismic sensors woke up as well, registering movement not at the surface, but below it, down in the range where the mapped voids in the rock began, a signature consistent with something passing through the formation underneath the property. 3 separate kinds of physics, 3 separate instruments, all agreeing, in sequence, on the same stretch of northern boundary, in the same narrow window of minutes. And still, on every camera trained on that section of fence, the desert showed nothing but empty ground under a clear, star-heavy sky. Then, at 23 minutes past 2, the infrared cameras logged their first anomaly, and what came just before it is the detail that unsettled the team more than anything that followed. In the 3 frames immediately preceding the event, the ambient thermal reading of the empty desert itself dropped, not the reading of any object, because there was no object yet to register, but the reading of the sagebrush, the fence posts, the bare packed dirt, all of it falling in unison across a span of less than half a second, as though something had reached into that patch of night and drawn the heat out of it before ever arriving. Then, in the following frame, a shape was there. It appeared simultaneously on 2 overlapping cameras angled from different positions along the fence, both agreeing completely on its location, which mattered enormously to a team that had spent a career being skeptical of single-camera anomalies. A smear on one lens is an artifact. The same shape, at the same coordinate, on 2 independent instruments, is something else. Nobody on the review team said much when they first watched it. One of them later described it, half joking and half not, as the kind of silence that happens right after a car accident, the beat before anyone remembers how to speak. The first outside call they made wasn't to a journalist or a paranormal outlet looking for a story. It was to an independent physicist with no history in that kind of research, and no particular reason to want the footage to mean anything at all, because what the team wanted, more than confirmation, was somebody who would look at the data with no investment in being frightened by it. When 4 independent streams, the field reading, the infrasound arriving early, the ground vibration tracing to the depth of the mapped hollows below, and the thermal footage all corroborate the same event along the same short stretch of fence in the same narrow window of minutes, you're no longer looking at a story that collapses under a second glance. You're looking at a pattern that gets stranger the more carefully anyone examines it, which is, as any real investigator will tell you, exactly backwards from how most hauntings behave once you actually bring the instruments in. That's where this story ends, because it was never meant to resolve into an answer, only into a better question. If you were the one standing behind that camera, watching a shape hold its distance along a fence line for 47 frames before vanishing without a trace of motion, what would you have wanted to do next? Walk toward it, to see if it held its ground the way it seemed to want to. Or step back, and let whatever it was keep whatever distance it had already chosen for itself. This is fiction, built for the shape of the question, not a claim about anything real, but the question itself doesn't need a real ranch to be worth sitting with in the dark.